At 40, Miriam Vale Harker had $23.40, a carpet bag with a broken latch, and a divorce settlement that gave her ex-husband the freight company, the Virginia City apartment, and their 17-year-old daughter. It gave Miriam a stone ruin on a frozen mountain pass that nobody wanted. She had married Elias Harker at 19 and spent 21 years hiding the only skills she had, stonework, chimney repair, firebox construction, because he called it dirty man's work. When he left her for a woman half her age, he made sure the whole territory knew why. The last thing the court assigned her was an abandoned Pony Express relay station, 14 miles above a town called Mercy Creek, listed at zero value. She paid $1 to record the deed. 3 men in the courthouse laughed. One said she would not last to first snow. Miriam climbed that mountain road alone with everything she owned in one bag. And when she knelt beside the keeper's room wall and tapped a bone-handled awl against the stone, one block answered hollow. And behind it, sealed in dust and silence, was a chamber that had been waiting for her longer than she knew. The courthouse in Mercy Creek smelled of ink, damp wool, and floor wax that had been applied too many times over wood that had warped past saving. Late October light came through 2 narrow windows and laid pale rectangles on the plank floor. A wood stove in the corner ticked as it cooled, underfed since morning. Miriam Vale Harker sat on the left side of the clerk's table with her hands flat on her skirt and her carpet bag between her boots. The bag was faded brown with one brass latch that no longer clicked unless she pressed it with both thumbs. Inside it was everything she owned: a bone-handled awl from her father's tool roll, 2 pairs of wool stockings with gray-darned heels, a cracked tin photograph of herself at 17 standing beside her father's stone yard, a blue calico dress folded around a chipped white enamel cup, a small Bible with the front cover missing, and a hand-drawn flue diagram her father had made when she was 13. Elias Harker stood on the other side of the table beside Clara Voss, who was 23, and wore Miriam's former garnet brooch at her collar. Miriam noticed the brooch before she noticed Clara. She had pinned it to her own wedding dress 21 years ago, when Elias was 22, and still thought it was charming that his bride could identify the grade of mortar in a foundation wall by running her thumb across it. That was before he discovered that charm had a shelf life, that a wife who could change a fan belt by the time she was 12 became an embarrassment by the time she was 30, that a woman who had learned stonework, draft reading, chimney clearing, and firebox repair from a traveling mason father named Amos Vale was expected in Elias Harker's household to hide her father's tools in a flour barrel behind the shed and never mention what her hands knew how to do. The clerk spread the final settlement papers across the oak surface and pointed to a line with the back end of his pen. Miriam signed. Her handwriting was small, steady, and tilted slightly left, the way her father had taught her to write with cold hands. Elias corrected the clerk's pronunciation of Clara's last name, but did not mention that Miriam's middle name had been misspelled on the settlement document. It read Marion instead of Miriam. She did not correct it either. 21 years, and he had not learned to check her name. The stone lintel above the courthouse door was settling unevenly. Miriam could see the hairline fracture running diagonally from the keystone to the right jamb. A competent mason could have reset it with a shim and fresh mortar in half a day. She almost said so. Then she closed her mouth, the way she had been closing her mouth for 21 years. The clerk counted back her cash. $23.40. Miriam placed the coins into the chipped enamel cup because her purse was gone. She had left it in the apartment Elias now shared with Clara, and she was not going back for it. The coins clicked against the enamel with a sound like a small bell struck underwater. She removed her wedding band and placed it on the table beside the inkstand. She did not slide it. She set it down the way a person sets down a glass they have decided not to drink from. Elias did not pick it up. Clara shifted her weight from one foot to the other and studied the edge of the table. Outside, the October wind dragged dust through wagon ruts on the main road. The courthouse steps were cold through the soles of Miriam's boots. She had $23.40, a carpet bag, no husband, no room, and a 17-year-old daughter named Lottie who had stayed with Elias because he controlled the money, the reputation, and the apartment in Virginia City. Lottie had not come to the courthouse. Miriam had asked. Elias had said Lottie was busy. Miriam knew what that meant. The last time Miriam slept indoors was 4 nights ago, on a feed sack behind Boone's livery stable, under a wool horse blanket that smelled of oats, sweat, and old rain. Before that, 3 nights in a chair at Mrs. Boone's kitchen table, sitting upright because she did not want to presume. Before that, the hallway of the freight office while Elias packed her things into one bag and set it outside the door with the latch unclasped. He had chosen the bag himself, the carpet bag with the broken latch, the one he knew she would have to fight open every time. The clerk appeared on the steps behind her. "There is the matter of the mountain parcel." Miriam turned. "Mercy Ridge Relay Station," the clerk said. "Old Kingsbury Spur. It was included in your settlement as an asset. Mr. Harker listed it at 0 value." "He would," Miriam said. "The recorder's office needs $1 consideration for the ledger, otherwise the transfer is incomplete." Miriam reached into the enamel cup and took out a $1 coin. She handed it to the clerk. $22.40, she said to no one. The recorder's office was attached to the courthouse by a hallway that smelled of cedar wood shavings and mouse droppings. A calendar on the wall showed September. Nobody had turned it. 3 men sat in the back row of the auction room waiting for a timber lot to come up. They wore heavy coats and mud-caked boots, and the patient expressions of men who had nowhere better to be. When the clerk read the name of the relay station, one of them laughed softly into his collar. "That pass killed better-stocked men than her," the man beside him said. "She won't last to first snow," the third said. He did not lower his voice. Miriam did not bid. She accepted the parcel as assigned, signed the transfer form, and paid the $1 consideration. The clerk stamped the deed and tied it with red string to a blackened iron key, 5 inches long, with teeth worn smooth on one side from years of use by a hand stronger than hers. "Ma'am," the clerk said, "I am required to hand you the key. I am not required to advise you to use it." Miriam took the key. It was heavier than it looked, heavy enough to feel deliberate, as if the man who had last used it had expected the next person to know what weight meant. She wrapped the deed around it and placed both in the carpet bag beside the enamel cup. Outside, the wind had picked up. It carried the smell of sage and cold dirt, and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from the diner chimney on Main Street. Miriam bought 3 biscuits from the baker's cart on the corner, wrapped them in a sheet of newspaper, and tucked them into the bag beside the Bible. She started up the road toward the old Kingsbury Spur before anyone in town could watch her hesitate. The old Kingsbury Spur climbed 14 miles from Mercy Creek into the eastern foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The road narrowed from a wagon track to a stone shelf within the first 3 miles. Sage gave way to pine. The air thinned and sharpened, carrying the smell of pitch and snowmelt. Miriam's carpetbag handle cut into her palm until she switched hands, then cut into the other. She passed 2 collapsed telegraph poles leaning against the hillside like broken ribs. An abandoned mine entrance, boarded and marked with a faded red X. A frozen creek bed running parallel to the road, the ice thin enough to see dark water moving underneath. She ate 1 biscuit at the 7-mile mark and drank from a snow-melt seep that ran across the road in a thread of clear water. The relay station appeared at mile 14, half swallowed by granite. Its stone face was gray against the cliff, the door leaning inward on rusted hinges, chimney stacks rising from the roofline like broken fingers. The tack shed had collapsed into a pile of timber and tin. The cistern was glazed with ice. Wind had polished the door's surface until the grain stood out like the veins on an old hand. Miriam set the carpetbag down and looked at the building the way her father had taught her to look at stone, not at the surface, but at the joints. The cliff wall behind the station was dry. The foundation stones had not shifted. The flagstone floor, visible through the open door, was level. The roof beams where they met the stone wall pockets showed gray weathering, but no rot. The bones were good. The key fought the lock. Miriam pressed her shoulder against the door and leaned. It opened with a sound like a cough, low, dry, reluctant. The first smell was cold ash and mouse dust layered over something older and mineral, the smell of stone that has held heat and lost it. The main hall opened before her. Massive flagstone floor, two long stone benches built into the walls, an empty peg rail running the length of the room, and a faded relay schedule nailed crooked beside the door. Pale rectangles of winter light fell through broken shutters onto the flagstones. She stepped inside, and the air changed, still cold, but different. Enclosed. The cold of a room, not a road. She moved through the stable bay. 6 stalls with chewed rails and iron rings set into the stone walls. Old hay dust in corners. A cracked leather girth strap hung from a peg. The smell of manure had long since dried into mineral dust, faint and earthy, like the floor of a cave. The keeper's room was small, an iron bed frame with a straw mattress collapsed flat. A writing desk pushed against the wall, its surface scarred with ink stains and candle drippings. A cold stove, a rusted coffee pot, mouse-chewed ledger pages scattered on the floor. Behind the desk, a narrow seam ran vertically through the stone wall. Miriam noticed it and moved on. Not yet. She climbed to the loft. Low beams forced her to duck. Bat droppings dusted the floor like black snow. A broken saddle tree leaned against the wall, its pommel split clean down the center. 3 sacks of oats had petrified into solid blocks, heavy as masonry. Through a gap in the roof where 2 shakes had blown free, she could see the sky turning the color of cold iron. The wind came through the gap in a thin whistle. Outside, she circled to the exterior firebox. It was built into the cliffside, large enough to take split cordwood, its mouth buried under brush and ice. She pulled back a tangle of dead manzanita, the branches snapping dry and brittle, releasing the smell of resin. She ran her hand across the stone facing. 3 draft vents, all blocked with packed grit and pine needles, an ash channel buried under a shelf of frozen mud. But there, carved into the facing stone, half hidden by soot, a draft mark, a mason's mark. Her fingers traced the shape before her mind named it. She knelt in the frozen dirt and pressed both palms against the firebox stone. It was the posture of prayer, but Miriam was not praying. She was reading. Reading the stone the way her father had taught her, with her hands with the flat of her cheek against the cold surface, with the sound the stone made when she tapped it with one knuckle. Solid. Dense. Cut by someone who knew where the grain ran. She had seen that mark before, on her father's tools, on the flue diagram folded in her carpet bag. Back inside, Miriam unfolded the diagram and smoothed it on the stone bench. The charcoal lines showed a heating system her father called a floor furnace, a firebox feeding hot air through channels beneath a stone floor, warming an entire room from below. The proportions on the diagram matched this building better than they should. She ate the second biscuit. She spread her canvas tarp over the main hall flagstones, wrapped herself in her coat, and placed the carpet bag under her head. The flue diagram lay beside the cracked enamel cup, both silvered by moonlight coming through the broken shutter. Wind moved through the empty stable stalls. One loose hinge tapped every 8 seconds, steady as a clock. Snowmelt ticked inside the chimney stone. Miriam did not feel hope. She felt stillness, a building that had not asked her to be smaller. Through the broken shutter, the stars appeared, more than she had seen in 21 years, the kind that only show where the nearest light is 14 miles away. She watched them until sleep came. She woke before dawn with frost on her coat and the taste of cold metal in her mouth. Her hands were stiff. She flexed them 10 times each, the way her father had done every morning of his life before they moved. By first light, she was outside at the firebox clearing brush. She ripped manzanita and dead pine boughs from the stone facing by hand, then used the bone-handled awl to scrape packed granite grit from the firebox door. The awl's yellowed handle was warm in her grip despite the cold, the hairline crack near the brass collar familiar against her thumb. She cleared the 3-block draft vents with a stick, then reached inside and felt for the ash channel. Her arm disappeared to the elbow. The channel was packed but intact. Then she felt it, a faint pull of air, inward. Through a blocked vent that should have been sealed against the mountain, she felt the station breathing. She went inside. In the keeper's room, she stood beside the desk and pressed her palm flat to the wall, where the narrow seam ran vertically through the stone. Cold dust breathed against her skin through the hairline gap. She tapped the wall with the awl. Solid. She moved 6 inches right and tapped again. Solid. 6 inches more. Hollow. She pressed her cheek against the stone and smelled old soot. Miriam dragged the desk away from the wall. The legs screeched across the flagstone. She knelt and scraped mortar from the seam with the awl, working the point into the gap until gray dust poured out in a thin stream. The blocks here were narrower than the rest of the wall. The mortar was darker, mixed with a different sand. She went to the stable bay and came back with a pry bar and a horseshoe. She wedged the horseshoe under the lowest block, fitted the pry bar into the seam, and pulled. Nothing. She repositioned, pulled again. The block shifted a 1/4 inch with a sound like a tooth loosening. She rested. Her arms shook. She pulled again. The false panel moved, not swinging open, but grinding across grit, inch by inch, stone dragging against stone. Dust fell in a single gray sheet. Behind the wall, a narrow chamber opened into darkness. The air inside was cool and dry and smelled of leather and old paper. Miriam reached in, and her hand found the edge of a metal box. She pulled the box out first. Heavy, locked. Then a stack of leather-bound journals, their spines cracked and soot-darkened. Then folded maps. Then a bundle of photographs tied with cord. Then a stack of labeled folders, thick with papers, organized alphabetically by family name. She carried everything to the main hall and spread it across the stone bench in the rectangle of morning light. Dust rose from the journals and hung in the beam like gold smoke. The journal was brown leather, its pages dated from 1861 to 1878. The handwriting was small, neat, and upright in the early entries, leaning harder right in later years. The pen pressed deeper into the paper as if the hand had grown heavier with each winter. The pages smelled of soot and dried ink and something faintly metallic, the smell of a room where fire was always burning. Miriam opened to a page at random. March 3rd, 1864. Widow Bell lost 2 fingers to frostbite, left flour, salt pork, 3 candles, took no receipt. She turned forward. December 19th, 1867. Amos Vale's woman fevered after birth. Paid Dr. Leland $6. Child small, but breathing. Miriam read the entry twice. She read it a 3rd time. Her finger rested under the word breathing until the pad of her fingertip grew warm against the page. She turned further. January 8th, 1871. Parker boy found in East Ravine with cracked wheel and 2 mules down. Pulled him free. He thanked the animals before he thanked God. February 12th, 1875. Cleared lower flue. Stone held heat 11 hours after fire died. Amos's girl understood the draft faster than any man I have shown. Miriam stopped reading. Her hands were still. The main hall was quiet except for wind against the stone walls and the faint ticking of snowmelt inside the chimney. She reached for the photograph bundle. The first image showed a man standing beside the relay station firebox, one hand black with soot, squinting into the sun. He was broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, with a leather apron and the kind of posture that comes from decades of lifting stone. The second photograph showed 2 men standing over the open flagstone floor during construction, the floor she had slept on last night. One of them was the same man. The other was Amos Vale, her father, younger than she had ever known him, with dark hair and the same square hands she remembered. The third photograph was Miriam herself, age 13, holding a mason's line, looking directly into the camera with the expression of someone who has not yet been told to stop knowing things. The fourth showed 8 snowbound travelers eating at the stone benches in the main hall, the same benches where Miriam now sat. Their faces were worn and grateful and lit by firelight. She set the photographs down on the bench and opened the metal cash box with the pry bar. Inside, gold eagles, silver dollars, and Wells Fargo drafts, folded neatly and sorted by denomination. She did not count them yet. The weight alone told her this was more money than she had touched in years. The letter was at the bottom of the chamber, in an envelope yellowed and soft at the edges, sealed with wax that had long since dried to the color of rust. The front read, in the same handwriting as the journal, "Amos Vale's girl, if she ever finds her way back." Miriam broke the seal with her thumbnail. The paper inside was a single sheet, folded once. The handwriting here was steadier than the later journal entries, as if Silas had written it on a good day, a day when his hand did not shake. "If you are reading this, Miriam, you found the warmest room in the mountain the hard way. Your father and I built the floor furnace in the summer of 1858, before the relay company knew there was a station to staff. We laid the channels with riverstone and sealed them with clay mortar mixed with the red sand from the lower creek. The stone underneath these flagstones holds heat the way a good person holds a promise, longer than anyone expects, and without asking for credit. I knew your father. I knew your mother. I paid Dr. Leland $6 the night you were born because your mother's fever was too high and your father could not leave her side. You were small and blue, and the doctor said he had seen worse live. I believed him because I needed to. The money in this box is not a fortune. It is 37 years of what I did not spend. Use it to keep this station open, keep the firebox clear, keep coffee on the bench, and never let a desperate person knock twice." Silas Mercer, Miriam sat on the keeper's room floor with the letter in one hand and the tin photograph in the other. The photograph showed her at 17, standing beside her father's stone yard, before Elias, before the freight company, before 21 years of hiding her hands. She pressed the photograph against her chest. She did not cry. She sat very still with her back against the stone wall and the letter on her knee and the building breathing its cold, dry breath around her. And she understood that the station was not a ruin she had accepted out of spite. It was a place that had been waiting. Hazel Boone's mule cart came up the spur road just after dawn the next morning. Miriam heard the wheels first, iron rims on loose stone, a rhythm slower than walking, then the mule's breath, then nothing, because Hazel stopped 30 yards from the station and sat on the cart seat looking. She looked at the cleared firebox. She looked at Miriam's torn gloves. She looked at the smoke stain on Miriam's sleeve where she had reached into the ash channel. She took her time. She was 68 with broad shoulders and a gray braid tucked under a black felt hat, hands cracked from lye soap, and she drove the cart with the ease of a woman who had been driving that mule longer than some people in Mercy Creek had been alive. One wheel on the cart was painted red. The rest were bare wood. Hazel climbed down from the cart seat with the deliberate care of a woman whose knees remembered every winter she had worked through. She stood at the edge of the road and looked at the station for a long time, not at the damage, but at the chimney stacks, the cleared vents, the scrape marks in the mortar where Miriam's awl had been. Silas Mercer kept 12 people alive in this building during the whiteout of '69, Hazel said. Heated the floor for 6 days straight, fed them from stores he had packed in August. When the snow melted and they could walk out, he wouldn't let anyone put his name in the paper, said the building did the work. She set a dented blue enamel pot on the stone bench. Coffee, still warm, the steam rising in the cold morning air. Then 2 boiled eggs, smooth and warm in their shells. Then a bundle of cedar kindling tied with twine so tight the bark had left red marks on the string. That man could make a door stop lying, Hazel said. She meant it both ways. The doors he repaired, and the truths he refused to let people bury. Miriam poured coffee into her cracked enamel cup. The cup had held coins yesterday. Today it held coffee. She drank standing up, the way her father had always taken his first cup. People called this place empty because they never knew how to look at a thing that was resting, Hazel said. She did not ask why Miriam was there. She did not ask about Elias or the divorce or where Miriam had been sleeping before this. She looked at the station the way she might look at an old friend who had been sick and was sitting up again, with relief, not pity. She left the blue enamel pot on the bench and said she would come back with lamp oil if the road held. Jonah Pike came walking behind Hazel's mule cart 2 days later, carrying a tool roll over one shoulder and a coil of stovepipe wire over the other. He was 27, lean, black-haired, with one shoulder higher than the other from an old wagon injury. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow even in the cold. He stopped at the base of the chimney stacks and tilted his head. He listened to the wind moving through the flues. Then he looked at the firebox, at the draft marks, at the cleared ash channel. Then he looked at Miriam's hands, calloused, torn at the knuckles, the nails packed with mortar dust. He did not ask whether she knew what she was doing. "Upper damper," Miriam said. "Frozen or broken?" Jonah set down the tool roll, opened the firebox throat, and put his ear close. He listened for 4 seconds. Then he pulled a 3/8-inch punch from the roll, drove out a bent damper pin with 2 clean strikes, reset the draft plate, and tested the draw by holding a lit match at the throat. The flame bent inward and held. 6 minutes. "Broken," Jonah said. "Not anymore." Miriam watched him close the firebox and roll his tools. His hands moved without hesitation. Each tool lifted, used, and returned to its place in the roll as if the leather had been cut to fit them. "I need someone who can make iron obi," Miriam said. "I'll work 1 week," Jonah said. "Don't make more of it." The rhythm established itself the way weather does, not announced, just present. Fire at dawn, flues cleared by noon, mortar mixed and covered by dusk, coffee always on the bench, hot enough to fog the tin cups Hazel brought on her 3rd visit. Miriam and Jonah cleared the 3 chimney stacks first. They lowered a weighted chain down each flue, the links clanking against stone in a descending scale, then followed it with an iron brush lashed to a rope, pulling soot and bird nests and petrified pine needles out in black clumps that stained the snow around the base. Jonah fed the rope from the rooftop, his boots braced against the stone cap. Miriam pulled from below, her boots braced against the firebox facing, her arms coated to the elbows in creosote that smelled of burnt pine and old winters. They dug out the exterior ash channel next, a trench of packed granite grit and pine duff running from the firebox beneath the foundation to the hollow space under the flagstones. Miriam used a coal shovel. Jonah used a hand trowel. The channel was 18 inches wide and lined with flat river stones set in clay mortar, the same red sand mortar Silas had described in his letter. It took 2 days. By the end of the 2nd day, Miriam's shoulders ached in a way that felt like language returning to a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. They replaced 2 cracked flagstones with granite slabs that Miriam found in the ravine below the station. Each slab weighed as much as a grown man. They dragged them up on rollers made from pine poles, the way Miriam's father had moved hearthstones. Jonah shaped the edges with a cold chisel, striking clean and even, chips flying in small white arcs. Miriam mixed lime mortar in a bucket, adding river sand until the consistency matched what her father had called stiff cream. She set the slabs herself, leveling each with a straight piece of cedar and checking the seams with the bone-handled awl. The same tool, the same motion, the same slight tilt of the head her father had used. Her hands remembered before her mind did. They rehung the main door with salvaged strap hinges. 16 penny nails. Jonah drilled the pilot holes through the stone jamb with a hand drill while Miriam held the door plumb. The door closed flush for the first time in 23 years. The sound it made, wood meeting stone with a solid final contact, was the sound of a building remembering what it was for. They patched the roof gap with cedar shakes and tarred canvas. Jonah worked from the outside, fitting each shake into the gap like a card into a deck, his fingers red and raw in the November wind. Miriam applied tar from below with a flat stick, sealing each seam against snowmelt. That night, no starlight came through the loft ceiling, the first fully dark night in that room in 23 years. They rebuilt the firebox throat last. Jonah forged a new iron draft plate on a portable anvil he carried in a leather sling. The hammer rang against the metal in sharp, clean strokes that echoed off the cliff wall. Miriam laid the lime mortar course around it. 3 rows of cut stone, each fitted and leveled before the next was started, each joint pointed smooth with the flat of the awl. The community arrived the way snow arrives, not all at once, but steadily, until the ground was covered. Hazel Boone came with beans and said she had cooked too much for one person. She set the pot on the bench beside the enamel coffee pot and did not explain further. Her brother was buried in Mercy Creek because Silas Mercer had covered the cost after the mine collapse and never spoken of it to anyone except his journal. Tom Arlen, the blacksmith from town, brought 4 hinge pins wrapped in oilcloth and said the old ones were cluttering his forge. He stood in the doorway and looked at Jonah's draft plate and nodded once, the way a man nods when he recognizes his own teaching in someone else's work. His father's mule had been shod by Silas for free every spring for 11 years. Mrs. Rowena Pike, Jonah's mother, brought 2 quilts folded in a flour sack and said moths would get them at her place. She stood in the main hall and looked at the rebuilt firebox and the clean flues and the light coming through oiled parchment where broken glass had been, and she pressed her lips together but did not speak. Silas had paid Jonah's apprenticeship fee to Tom Arlen when Jonah was 14, after Jonah's father froze to death on the pass. Schoolteacher Martha Quill brought 4 older boys to haul brush for what she called arithmetic practice, measuring loads by volume. The boys worked without complaint, which meant Martha Quill had told them something about the station they did not want to disrespect. Silas had bought her first classroom stove and installed it himself on a Saturday morning before the children arrived. Caleb Rusk brought a cord of split pine in a mule cart and said it had split wrong for his stove at home. He unloaded it against the station wall in neat rows, bark side up, the way a man stacks wood, who was taught by someone who cared about drying time. His mother had been pulled from a snow ditch by Silas during a storm that killed 3 horses on the pass. Mountain news traveled without wires. Nobody explained how they knew Miriam was there. Nobody asked how long she planned to stay. They came, they brought something, they connected it to Silas, and they left without lingering. Hazel's blue enamel pot became permanent on the main stone bench. By the second week, people poured coffee without asking. The pot was never empty. Miriam did not track who refilled it. It simply stayed full. The station transformed. Broken glass replaced with oiled parchment that let in light the color of weak tea. Flagstone floor scrubbed from black to gray. Stable bay cleared, stalls swept, iron rings oiled until they turned without sound, chimney drawing clean for the first time in 23 years. And on the morning, Miriam fired the exterior furnace for the first time, feeding split pine into the firebox, adjusting the 3 draft vents with the iron handles Jonah had forged, and listening to the draw settle into a low, steady roar. The heat crept through the ash channel, through the hollow spaces beneath the flagstones, and rose into the main hall like breath returning to a body that had held still too long. Jonah stood barefoot on the warm stone and said nothing for a full minute. Silas built the floor to hold people, Miriam said. Not horses. People. Jonah nodded. He poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the warm flagstones. Steam rose from the cup and from the floor simultaneously. Outside, the November stars appeared above the ridgeline, sharp and white and indifferent to everything that had been repaired below them. The sound came from below, not from the road, from the valley, a carriage. Matched horses at a trot, harness brass ringing faintly, wheels running too smooth for the spur road. Miriam was patching mortar on the south chimney stack when she heard it. She set down the trowel and wiped her hands. Elias Harker's carriage came around the last switchback, black lacquer catching the morning sun, brass lamps polished, a matched bay team pulling the rig with the easy stride of horses that had never been asked to carry anything they did not want to. The kind of carriage that cost more than most Mercy Creek families earned in 2 winters. Elias stepped down. Charcoal wool coat, polished boots, gloves softer than most people's winter blankets, silver watch chain. He studied the relay station the way he had once studied freight invoices, looking for the column that did not add up, the number he could use. He looked at the rehung door, the cleared firebox, the smoke rising from the chimney, the blue enamel pot on the bench. He looked at Jonah fitting a latch to the stable gate and at Hazel's mule cart parked beside the cistern. He took his time. "Miriam," he said. The way he said her name had not changed, as if he were correcting her. Elias. I see you've been busy. He looked at the mortar on her hands. He looked at the station the way a man looks at a horse he sold cheap that someone else made run. I have. He pulled a glove off one finger at a time and folded it into his coat pocket. This parcel is part of the Harker Freight Company's mountain right-of-way. It was assigned to you in error. My attorney has reviewed the original route maps, and the station sits on land the company used for access to the upper pass. Miriam said nothing. She held the trowel at her side the way another woman might hold a closed fan. I'm prepared to make a generous offer, enough to set you up in a room in Carson City. You could start fresh, warm, indoors. He paused. You deserve that. He said deserve the way he said everything, as if he were the one who decided what people earned. I am indoors, Miriam said. This isn't sustainable. You don't have the funds to defend a title challenge. You know that. You gave me the stone because you thought it was dead. Elias paused. He looked at the chimney, the smoke, the flagstones that he could not see were warm. Something moved behind his eyes. Not doubt, not yet, but the faint irritation of a man who has mispriced an asset and knows someone else has noticed. I'll have my attorney send the papers, he said. He climbed back into the carriage. The wheels threw frozen grit against the newly rehung door as the matched bay team pulled the rig around and down the spur road. The sound of the harness brass faded slowly, the way all expensive things leave, with no hurry and no apology. 3 days later, a deputy rode up the spur with a folded document in a leather case. Miriam opened it beside the firebox. The petition was dense, formal, and specific. Injunction against occupation, petition to quiet title, claim of trespass, demand to cease unauthorized alteration of a disputed structure. The paper was heavy stock, white, printed in a typeface too small to read by lamplight. Miriam folded the petition and set it on the bench beside the enamel cup. She had $22.15 left after nails, lamp oil, and flour. She counted the coins once. She counted them again. The number did not change. Outside, the wind moved through the chimney stacks. They drew clean now. The sound was low and steady, the sound of a building breathing through open lungs. If you've made it this far into Miriam's story, hit subscribe because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Gideon Price arrived in Hazel Boone's buckboard on the morning of the 8th day, with 2 days left before the petition required an answer. Hazel drove. Gideon sat beside her with a leather satchel on his lap and a wool blanket over his knees. He was older than Miriam expected, 70, maybe more, with a face carved deep by weather and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. He had been a circuit attorney before his knees gave out. Now he kept an office above the feed store in Mercy Creek and took cases when they interested him. He stepped down from the buckboard slowly, gripping the side rail with both hands, and stood in front of the relay station without speaking. He looked at the chimney stacks drawing smoke. He looked at the firebox, the cleared ash channel, the stacked cordwood. He looked at the alphabetized folders spread across the stone bench inside the main hall, visible through the open door. He looked at Miriam's face, not at her expression, but at her hands, which were still and waiting at her sides. Then he offered his hand. Hazel tells me Silas Mercer built this place, Gideon said. Silas Mercer and my father, Miriam said. Amos Vale. Gideon said the name the way a person says the name of someone they have not forgotten. I knew Amos. He repaired my chimney in '63, charged me half what it was worth, and told me to pay the rest forward. He paused. I didn't know he had a daughter until Hazel told me yesterday. I've been easy to miss, Miriam said. Gideon did not smile, but something shifted behind his spectacles. He set his satchel on the stone bench and opened it. Show me the deed. Show me the settlement. Show me everything Silas left. Miriam showed him. It took Gideon 3 hours. He read the divorce decree line by line, running his finger beneath the language the way a mason runs a thumb along a joint. He read Silas's journal. He read the alphabetized folders. he found 3 papers that mattered. The original land patent, issued to Silas Mercer in 1857, recorded in the Territorial Land Office with a survey number, a boundary description, and a wax seal that had turned the color of dried blood. A notarized transfer of maintenance rights from Silas Mercer to Amos Vale, dated 1862, witnessed by 2 names Gideon recognized from the county rolls. And the divorce settlement itself, the document Miriam had signed 10 days ago on the courthouse table, in which Elias Harker had listed the Mercy Ridge relay station at a value of $0 and disclaimed it as an unproductive mountain parcel of no commercial or residential worth. Gideon set the 3 documents side by side on the bench. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the documents the way Miriam looked at stone, reading what was underneath. "Your husband valued this property at nothing," Gideon said. "He signed a decree accepting all profitable assets and disclaiming this parcel. He cannot now claim it has value he failed to assert. He'll say it was a mistake. A man who runs a freight company does not accidentally disclaim a mountain right-of-way. He'll say it, but the record says otherwise." Gideon folded his spectacles and set them on the bench. "I'll file the answer. I'll present the deed chain. I'll argue the settlement language." Miriam looked at the cash box on the keeper's desk. She had counted the contents the day before: $2,860 in gold eagles, silver dollars, and Wells Fargo drafts. Enough to rebuild, not enough to lose on an attorney's fee that stretched past the hearing. "I can't pay you what this is worth," she said. "This fee was paid 18 years ago," Gideon said, "by a man who would not let my boy lose his leg." He told her the rest while Hazel poured coffee. His son, age 11, had been crushed under a freight wagon wheel on the Virginia City Road. The leg was shattered in 3 places. The nearest surgeon wanted $40. Gideon had $12. Silas Mercer appeared at the surgeon's office that evening, paid the balance, and left before Gideon could thank him. The folder marked "Price Gideon" in Silas's records confirmed it. Date, amount, outcome. The boy kept his leg. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He was 29 now and drove freight for a company in Carson City. The Mercy Creek Courthouse was cold on the morning of the hearing. November had settled into the valley like a guest who intended to stay. Frost clung to the inside of the window panes. The wood stove near the judge's bench was burning but undersized for the room. 14 people sat in the gallery: Hazel Boone, Jonah Pike, Tom Arlen, Martha Quill, Caleb Rusk, Mrs. Rowena Pike, and 8 others whose names Miriam did not know, but whose faces she had seen at the station, carrying kindling, carrying bread, carrying the quiet debts Silas Mercer had planted in their families like seeds. Elias sat on the right side of the aisle with a Virginia city attorney named Carver, who wore a black coat and kept his notes in a leather portfolio embossed with gold initials. Elias wore the charcoal wool coat. Clara was not present. Elias looked at Miriam once, briefly, the way a person looks at a door they expected to find locked and found open. Gideon Price stood with effort, steadied himself against the counsel table, and addressed Judge Althea Marr, a woman of 55 with iron-gray hair pulled back severely and the kind of eyes that made attorneys choose their words with more care than they might have otherwise. Carver spoke first. He argued abandonment, that the station had been vacant for 23 years, that Miriam had no legal standing to occupy or alter a disputed structure, and that the Harker Freight Company's mountain route required access through the station's land. He spoke in the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who charged by the hour and wanted the court to feel every minute was well spent. Gideon spoke second. He did not stand smoothly. He did not speak smoothly. He laid the 3 documents on the table: the land patent, the notarized transfer, and the divorce settlement. And he read from each one in a voice that cracked at the edges but did not waver. "The land patent is recorded," Gideon said. "The chain of title runs from Silas Mercer to Amos Vale's maintenance rights and back to Mercer's estate, which designated this station as a public waypoint. The divorce decree, signed by both parties and entered by this court, assigns the parcel to Miriam Vale Harker. Mr. Harker's own hand valued the property at $0. His own signature disclaimed it." He held up the Harker Freight Ledger, the company's own records, which Miriam had found in the stable bay in a trunk of old paperwork. In the ledger, Elias had recorded the station's value as $0 for 3 consecutive tax years. "A man cannot discard what he does not want," Gideon said, "and then reclaim it when someone else makes it worth having." Carver objected. Judge Marr overruled. Gideon placed Silas's map on the table, the hand-drawn diagram of the floor furnace, the ash channels, the draft vents. He placed Miriam's flue diagram beside it. He placed the photograph of Amos Vale and Silas Mercer standing over the open floor during construction. "This station was built by Silas Mercer and Amos Vale," Gideon said. "It has been maintained, repaired, and reopened by Amos Vale's daughter. The title is clean. The transfer is recorded. The settlement is final." Judge Marr looked at the documents for a long time. She looked at Elias. She looked at Miriam. She looked at the gallery, which was silent. "The petition for injunction is denied," Judge Marr said. "The recorded transfer stands. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice." Miriam did not smile. She pressed both hands flat to the counsel table until the shaking stopped. The wood was cold under her palms. She held still until her fingers were steady, then lifted them, then placed them in her lap. Gideon sat down heavily. His hands trembled on the table. Hazel Boone exhaled from the gallery, a long, slow breath that carried 9 years of waiting for someone to come back to the station. Outside, the November sky was the color of old pewter. The wind had died. The flag above the courthouse hung limp. Miriam walked to the buckboard and climbed up beside Hazel without speaking. Gideon rode in the back, wrapped in his wool blanket, his satchel closed, his spectacles in his pocket. The mule started up the road. The iron rims rang against the frozen ground. Nobody said the word won. The word did not fit. The station was not a prize. It was a place that people had tried to let die, and Miriam had refused. Stars would come later, above the pass, above the station, above the warm floor where the fire was still burning because Jonah had fed it before dawn and would feed it again at dusk and every dusk after that until the snow gave way to spring. It happened 3 days after the hearing. Jonah was sorting the alphabetized folders in the keeper's room, organizing them by date instead of name, when he stopped. He was holding a folder marked Belle Sarah. Behind it, tucked into the back of the same drawer, was a second folder marked Vale Amos. It had been misfiled, or placed there deliberately, behind the name of a woman Silas had helped during the same winter. Jonah opened the folder. Inside was a single page in Silas's handwriting, the early handwriting, neat and upright, from 1867. The entry read, December 19th, 1867. Amos Vale's woman fevered after birth. Paid Dr. Leland $6, child small but breathing, named Miriam. Amos says she has his hands already. God willing, she will use them better than most men use theirs. Below the entry, in a later hand, shakier, leaning harder right, from the mid-1870s. Brought Amos's girl to study the flues today. She understood the draft on the first explanation. She put her hand on the stone and closed her eyes and told me where the channel turned before I showed her. Amos's hands. Better. She does not know what she carries. And below that, a final note, undated, in handwriting so unsteady it was barely legible. If the world is kind enough to send her back here, she will know what to do. She will not need instructions. She will need a key. Jonah brought the folder to the main hall. Miriam was sitting on the stone bench beside the coffee pot, mending a leather strap with the bone-handled awl. The afternoon light came through the oiled parchment windows and turned the floor the color of weak honey. The fire in the firebox ticked softly. Heat rose through the flagstones in waves she could feel through the soles of her boots. "There's something else in the records," Jonah said. He stood in the doorway between the keeper's room and the main hall, holding the folder with both hands. He did not come closer. "What is it?" Jonah did not answer the question. He walked to the bench and set the folder beside her. Then he stepped back. Miriam opened the folder. She read the first entry. Amos Vale's woman fevered after birth. Paid Dr. Leland $6. Child small but breathing. Named Miriam. Her hands were still. She read the second entry. Brought Amos's girl to study the flues today. She understood the draft on the first explanation. She put her hand on the stone and closed her eyes and told me where the channel turned before I showed her. Amos's hands. Better. She does not know what she carries. Her hands began to shake. She set the awl down on the bench. It rolled once and stopped against the enamel cup with a faint ceramic click. She read the third entry. If the world is kind enough to send her back here, she will know what to do. She will not need instructions. She will need a key. A key. A blackened iron key, 5 inches long, tied with red string. Handed to her by a clerk who did not advise her to use it. Miriam closed the folder. She did not close it the way a person closes something they are finished with. She closed it the way a person closes a door they need a moment behind. She reached into the carpetbag at her feet and pulled out the tin photograph. The one with the bent lower left corner and the blackened rim. The one that showed her at 17 beside her father's stone yard, before Elias, before the freight company, before all of it. Her young face looked out of the photograph with the expression of someone who had not yet been told to hide. She pressed the photograph against her chest with both hands. The main hall was silent. The fire ticked. Heat rose through the stone. Outside, wind moved across the granite cliff face with a sound like a hand drawn slowly across fabric. Silas Mercer had paid for the doctor who kept her alive. He had watched her grow up from a distance. He had brought her to this station and taught her the floor and the flues and the stone, and he had written her name in a journal she was not supposed to find unless the world sent her back. The world had sent her back. It had taken everything else first. "You weren't trespassing," Jonah said. His voice was quiet. He stood near the firebox with his hands at his sides. "You were coming back." Miriam did not answer. She sat with the photograph against her chest and the folder on her knee, and her eyes on the floor that her father had helped build, the floor that had held heat for 37 years, the floor that Silas Mercer had warmed for strangers because he believed that was what stone was for. She sat for a long time. The light moved across the flagstones. The fire settled. Jonah did not leave. He stood and waited the way a person waits beside someone who is finding their way back to the surface of something deep. When she stood, she moved differently. She picked up the awl and placed it on the keeper's desk, not in the carpetbag, not hidden, not folded inside a dress. On the desk, where a tool belongs when the person who owns it has decided to stay. Lottie Harker arrived 9 days later in a hired wagon from Virginia City, wearing city shoes that were already ruined by the time the wheels hit the spur road. The shoes were black leather with small buttons at the ankle, the kind that assumed flat wooden floors and swept boardwalks. By the 8th mile, the mud had climbed past the soles. The wagon stopped 40 yards from the station. Lottie did not get out immediately. She sat on the bench seat and looked at the building the way a person looks at something they have been told a story about and now must reconcile with the thing itself. Smoke rose from the chimney stacks. The main door was open. Inside, Hazel Boone sat on the stone bench shelling beans into a tin basin, her gray braid over one shoulder. Jonah Pike crouched beside the stable gate, fitting a new latch with a hand file, the sound of metal on metal sharp and rhythmic. Caleb Rusk's son was stacking kindling against the exterior wall in rows so neat they looked measured. Lottie climbed down. She was 17, with Miriam's jawline and Elias's posture, straight-backed, chin raised, as if height were something to be held rather than grown into. Her dress was Virginia City work, good wool, clean seams, a collar that had been pressed that morning. Miriam came around the corner of the station carrying a bucket of lime mortar. She saw Lottie and stopped. She set the bucket down. She did not cross the distance between them. Lottie crossed it instead. She walked through the mud in her ruined shoes and stopped 6 feet from her mother. She looked at Miriam's hands, mortar-dusted, cracked at the knuckles, the nails packed with stone grit. She looked at Miriam's face, which was thinner than it had been at the courthouse and darker from wind and work. Papa said you'd gone mad, Lottie said. Did he? He said you were living in a ruin to punish him. Miriam wiped her hands on her apron. Do you want coffee? Lottie did not answer. She looked past Miriam into the main hall, where the fire cast moving light across the flagstones and the stone benches held tin cups and ledger pages and Hazel's basin of shelled beans. It's warm, Lottie said. Not a question, an accusation. She had expected cold. Miriam led her inside. Lottie stood on the flagstones and looked down. She could feel the heat through the soles of her ruined shoes. She looked at the ceiling, the chimney, the walls. She could not find the stove that would explain the warmth. The floor, Miriam said. There's a furnace underneath. The stone holds the heat. That's not possible. Your grandfather built it. Lottie did not know what to do with that sentence. She stood on the warm floor and held her elbows and said nothing. Over the next 3 hours, Lottie watched. She watched Hazel pour coffee without asking and hand it to Jonah, who drank without pausing his work. She watched Martha Quill arrive with 2 boys carrying a basket of bread and leave with a wave. She watched Caleb Rusk ask Miriam whether the south chimney cap needed resetting and wait for her answer the way a man waits for an answer he intends to follow. She watched 3 men, Tom Arlen, Caleb, and a settler named Hugh Dean, whose wagon Silas had repaired 15 years ago, stand around the lower flue vent and discuss whether the draw was pulling evenly. They turned to Miriam. They waited. She knelt, put her hand over the vent, closed her eyes, and told them the left channel was partially blocked. She was right. They did not look surprised. They did not humor her. They relied on her. That was the thing Lottie could not reconcile. Not the building, not the heat, not the community gathering in a stone room on a frozen mountainside. The thing she could not reconcile was that her mother, the woman Elias had described as broken and spiteful and irrational, was standing in a room full of people who trusted her judgment about stone and heat and shelter. Who waited for her answer? Who acted on it without hesitation? That evening, Lottie sat on the bench beside the coffee pot. The fire was low. Hazel had gone. Jonah was oiling hinges in the stable bay. The station was quiet except for the settling of the fire and the faint tick of heat moving through stone. He told me you chose this to make him look bad, Lottie said. I know what he told you. I believed him. Miriam did not answer that. She reached into the carpet bag and pulled out the flue diagram, her father's drawing, charcoal on paper, folded into 8 squares, the creases soft and dark with decades of handling. She unfolded it on the bench between them. Your grandfather drew this when I was 13, Miriam said. He brought me here. Silas showed me the flues. I put my hand on the stone and I knew where the channels turned before anyone told me. She paused. Your father called that dirty man's work. Lottie looked at the diagram. She looked at her mother's hands. I thought he left you because you were weak, Lottie said. Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. I think he left because you kept knowing things. Miriam did not say Lottie was right. She did not say Lottie was wrong. She folded the diagram back along its creases and handed it to Lottie. Hold the lamp tonight, Miriam said. I need to check the lower channel before the temperature drops. Lottie took the diagram. She held it the way a person holds something that has been offered carefully and should be received the same way. She stayed the night. She slept on the stone bench with a quilt from Mrs. Rowena Pike and her ruined shoes drying beside the firebox. At dawn, she tied up her city skirt with a piece of harness leather and helped Miriam scrub soot from the flagstones on her hands and knees, the brush strokes matching her mother's rhythm without instruction. The avalanche came 3 weeks into December, on a night when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours and the wind shifted from west to north with a sound like a door slamming in an empty house. The sky had been clear at sunset. By 9 clouds sealed the pass from ridgeline to ridgeline, and the first snow came sideways, driven by wind that bent the pine tops flat. The snow hit the upper pass at midnight. A wagon train of 18 settlers, 11 horses, and 4 children had been climbing toward the summit when the route collapsed beneath 6 feet of sudden white. Among them, in a hired coach with brass fittings and wool curtains, was Elias Harker. Clara Voss sat beside him, her hands in a fur muff, her face pale. Behind them, in a trunk wagon driven by a freight hand, was Lottie's hope chest, the only reason Elias had been on the pass road at all, delivering it to a cousin in Placerville who had offered to store it. The avalanche sealed the road above and below the station. Snow buried the window sills of the main hall by 2 Sassuwais in the morning. The settlers stumbled in through the main door, frost white, shaking, carrying children who had stopped crying because the cold had taken the energy for it. They smelled of wet wool and horse sweat and the sharp mineral scent of snow that has been driven into fabric by wind. Miriam fired the exterior furnace and kept it burning. She fed split pine into the firebox every 45 minutes for 2 days straight, adjusting the draft vents by ear, listening for the change in pitch that meant the draw was pulling evenly through all 3 channels. Jonah carried cordwood from the stacked supply against the wall, his boots crunching through drifted snow that reached his thighs, his breath freezing on his collar. Hazel Boone, who had been at the station since the previous afternoon shelling beans, put coffee on and did not stop making it for 48 hours. Her hands moved between the pot and the cups with the steady rhythm of a woman who understood that warmth delivered through a tin cup was as important as warmth rising through stone. Heat moved through the ash channel, through the hollow spaces beneath the flagstones, and rose into the main hall. By midnight of the first night, the room reached 80 degrees while snow buried the windows and the wind screamed across the granite cliff above. The settlers sat on the stone benches, their boots off, their feet on the warm floor, their faces slack with the particular expression of people who have accepted death and then been handed warmth instead. The 4 children slept on the flagstones wrapped in Rowena Pike's quilts. One of them, a girl of 5 with blonde hair matted with ice, pressed her cheek against the stone and said, "The floor's breathing." Miriam did not sleep. She monitored the draft vents every 2 hours, pressing her hand to the floor in different locations, checking for cold spots that would mean a blockage in the channel. She found one dot in the northeast corner, near the stable wall, and cleared it at 4 Noah's Abai in the morning by crawling beneath the flagstones through an access hatch Silas had built into the ash channel for exactly this purpose. Elias was among the last to enter the station. He came through the door with snow in his hair and his charcoal coat soaked dark. He stopped 3 steps inside. He looked at the room. He looked at the warm floor, the fire, the sleeping children, the coffee pot on the bench. He looked at Miriam, who was on her knees beside a draft vent with soot on her face and the bone-handled awl in her hand. He did not speak. He sat on the stone bench and held his hands over the warm floor, and he did not speak for a long time. On the second day, while the snow still fell and the road remained sealed, Elias found Silas's alphabetized folders on the keeper's desk. Miriam did not stop him. He opened the folder marked Harker Elias and read the entry inside. January 8th, 1871. Harker boy found in East Ravine with cracked wheel and 2 mules down. Pulled him free. Road was iced past walking. Brought him to station, warmed him, fed him, sent him home at dawn. He offered $20. Refused. A man does not charge for pulling another man out of a ditch. His freight line will run because he lived. That is sufficient. Elias read the entry twice. He closed the folder. He sat holding it on his lap with both hands flat against the leather, the way a man holds something that has changed the weight of everything above it. He did not say anything to Miriam that day. He slept on the stone bench with the settlers and the children. His charcoal coat hung over a peg to dry, his polished boots standing in a row with the settlers' muddy ones. In the morning, when the snow was still falling and the road was still sealed, he helped Jonah carry cordwood without being asked. He carried it the way a man carries wood who has not carried wood in a long time. Awkwardly, 2 logs at a time, but without complaint and without stopping. On the 3rd night, Clara Voss sat beside the fire and watched Miriam adjust the draft vents. She watched for a long time. Then she unpinned the garnet brooch from her collar and set it on the bench beside Miriam's enamel cup. She did not say anything. Miriam looked at the brooch. She did not pick it up. "Keep it," Miriam said. "It was never about the brooch." Clara nodded. She pinned it back. Something between them did not heal exactly, but it stopped bleeding. The road opened on the fourth day. The settlers left in groups, walking down the spur toward Mercy Creek, leading horses that had survived because the stable bay was dry, and Jonah had kept water thawed in the trough by carrying heated stones from the firebox every 3 hours. Elias did not leave with them. He came back 6 days later, not in the lacquered carriage with the brass lamps and the matched bay team. In a plain freight wagon, the kind his company used for hauling supplies on routes that did not impress anyone. He wore no charcoal coat. He wore a canvas jacket, heavy trousers, and work boots that had not been polished. He pulled the wagon to the base of the station wall and climbed down. In the bed, split cordwood, 4 sacks of lime, a bundle of cedar planks, and a folded document. Miriam came to the door. She held the awl at her side. She did not step outside. Elias did not study the station this time. He looked at Miriam directly. "I brought wood," he said. "Lime, cedar, and a signed quitclaim. My attorney filed it with the recorder yesterday." Miriam looked at the wood in the wagon bed. It was split clean, bark side up, stacked the way a person stacks wood who has thought about drying time. "You win," Elias said. Miriam looked at the wood first. She looked at the lime, the cedar, the document folded on the wagon seat. "No," she said. "They lived." Elias nodded. He unloaded the wood himself, carrying each armload to the wall and stacking it beside the supply Caleb Rusk had brought. He worked without speaking. When the wagon was empty, he stood beside it and looked at the station once more. The smoke, the open door, the warm light on the flagstones, douam, and climbed back up to the seat. He left slowly. The wagon wheels ground against the frozen road. The sound carried a long time in the thin mountain air. Lottie, standing in the doorway beside Miriam, watched the wagon disappear around the switchback. She did not say anything about her father. She handed Miriam the enamel cup, filled with coffee, and went inside to check the draft. 5 months later, the snow was gone. Spring came to the eastern foothills the way it always came, not gradually, but in a rush, as if the mountain had been holding its breath since November and finally let go. The creek below the station ran high and fast, brown with snowmelt, loud enough to hear from the main hall. Manzanita bloomed in clusters of pink and white along the spur road. The air smelled of wet pine and warm granite, and the particular sweetness of earth that has been frozen and is not anymore. Mercy Ridge Relay Station had clean windows, real glass now, purchased with Silas Mercer's savings, installed by Jonah Pike with lid caulking and cedar frames. The doors hung straight on iron hinges that Jonah had forged to match the originals. Smoke rose from a rebuilt chimney into a sky so blue it looked deliberate. 6 cots lined the stable bay, each with a wool blanket folded at the foot. The pantry held flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, sugar, tinned meat, and 40 candles in a cedar box. A sign hung beside the main door, painted in Miriam's square block handwriting, the same handwriting as her father's, the same handwriting as Silas Mercer's draft marks. "Warm room open, knock once." Miriam had started the Silas Mercer Winter Fund with $100 or $200 of the cash box money. The fund covered food, fuel, and shelter for any traveler stranded on the pass between November and April. She had written the fund's purpose on the inside cover of a new ledger, in the same format Silas had used: date, name, need, amount, no receipt required. Lottie was learning. She could read a draft vent by ear now. She could identify a blocked channel by pressing her palm to the flagstones and feeling for the cold spot. She could not yet mix mortar by feel the way Miriam could, but she was 17, and her hands were learning faster than her mind could explain, the way hands do when the knowledge is inherited. Jonah Pike stayed. He did not say he was staying permanently. He simply did not leave. His tool roll hung on a peg beside the firebox. His anvil sat in the stable bay. Miriam had offered him the title of firebox master and blacksmith, and he had accepted with the words, "Sounds about right." On a warm evening in late March, the community gathered. Hazel Boone served coffee from the blue enamel pot, the same pot she had brought on that first morning, now dented in 2 new places and permanently stationed on the stone bench. Gideon Price sat by the window reading Silas's journal, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the last light. Martha Quill's students sat on the main hall floor, sketching the flue map with charcoal on brown paper, arguing about the angles of the channels the way children argue about things they find genuinely interesting. Tom Arlen leaned against the door frame and smoked a pipe. Caleb Rusk's mother, the woman Silas had pulled from a snow ditch, sat on the bench with a cup of coffee in her hands and said nothing, because some debts do not require words. 3 of the settlers who had survived the December avalanche came back. They brought bread, nails, wool, and stories. One of them, the father of the blonde girl who had said the floor was breathing, brought a framed daguerreotype of his daughter standing on the warm flagstones, barefoot, smiling, alive. He hung it on the wall beside the relay schedule. Evening fell. The last light turned the granite cliff the color of copper, then amber, then gray. Lamps came on one by one inside the station, oil lamps in tin brackets that Jonah had mounted at intervals along the stone walls, their light steady and golden, the kind of light that makes stone look warm even before the fire is lit. Miriam hung Amos Vale's flue diagram in a cedar frame beside Silas Mercer's map. The 2 drawings shared the same correction mark in the lower corner. Side by side, they looked like a conversation between 2 men who had agreed on what mattered. The bone-handled awl rested on the keeper's desk, not hidden, not folded in a dress. On the desk where it belonged, its yellowed handle catching the lamplight, the hairline crack near the brass collar visible only if you knew to look. The cracked enamel cup sat beside Hazel's coffee pot on the stone bench. It was no longer the only vessel Miriam owned, but it was the one she reached for first, every morning, the way a person reaches for the thing that carried them through the worst night and has earned its place at the table. The tin photograph, bent corner, blackened rim, Miriam at 17th, hung on the keeper's room wall above the desk, beside the photograph of Amos Vale and Silas Mercer standing over the open floor. Father and daughter separated by years in a wall, reunited by stone and heat and the stubbornness of people who build things the world calls worthless. Lottie came inside carrying the lamp from the lower flue check. Her hands were dirty. Her city shoes were gone, replaced by boots Hazel had found in a trunk at her place, worn soft, one size too large, perfect for a girl whose feet were still deciding what kind of ground they would walk on. "Lower channel is clear," Lottie said. "Drawing even." "Good," Miriam said. She poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Lottie. They drank standing up, the way Amos Vale had always taken his first cup, the way Miriam had taken hers every morning since she arrived, the way Lottie would take hers every morning from now on without being told. Outside, the stars came out. They appeared above the pass, above the granite cliff, above the old stone station, sharp and white and steady, the kind that appear where the nearest light is 14 miles away and the sky is so clean it looks new. Home was not the place that kept you from freezing. Home was the place you kept warm for the next person. The door remained open. The light stayed on. Above the pass, the stars held their positions over the old stone station, waiting for morning.